Okay, let's get started. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone back to the fall series for the WEFI seminars. And before we get started, I want to make a few notes on the fall seminar series. We're going to have 5 presentations spreading out from September until early December. And please check our website. It is a very exciting collection of papers and discussants, and we look forward to a very fruitful fall through our platform. And we also will have a student-run workshop that is going to happen in October the 11th. And if you're interested in that, particularly if you're students who wants to see what other students are working in other different institutions around the world, I think it's going to be a very exciting opportunity to do that. And today we're very excited to have our first WEFI seminar for the fall. And the paper is called, Did Western CEO Incentives Contribute to China's Technological Rise? And the presenter will be Bian from University of British Columbia, and Jean-Marie Meier from UT Dallas. The co-author is also here to answer any questions you might have. And we are very happy to have our discussant, Moqi Groen-Xu from Queen Mary, University of London, who is kind enough to discuss the paper. And just a few ground rules. We're going to have 40 minutes for the presentation, roughly 15 minutes for the discussant, and then we have a Q&A. And during the presentation, the co-author will answer some clarification questions in the chat channel. And with that, let's get started. Bo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Song. Hello, everyone. So thanks for having me here. I'm very grateful that Song and Mike are still organizing this online workshop and give us the chance to present. So this paper, as Song said, is trying to link Western CEO incentives to China's technological rise. I know that this can be a quite controversial topic, and I just want to have this statement at the very beginning that we are trying to present the patterns in the data as objective as we can. And, the findings in the paper do not represent my own political views or anything. So let's just have the statement there. And as you will see, this is quite early stage work, and there are tons of things that we can improve. So I really look forward to your comments, your questions, and also Moqi's discussion. All right. So we all know that the economic competition between US and China is a key factor in shaping US-China relationships. While the Trump administration focused on the US trade deficit with China, corporate America's main concern is, however, the forced technology transfer to China and the potential violation of IP rights. This ultimately speaks to China's quid pro quo policy. Basically, big multinational firms face a very difficult trade-off when dealing with China and the Chinese government. They have to trade off between getting the access to China's vast market versus transferring technology to China, and sometimes simply too much technology being transferred to China. So over the years, we see that Chinese competitors emerge at a global level with the presence of this policy. Examples include high-speed trains, renewable energy, and also turbines. Many people, including business executives, policymakers, and also just the public, they have attributed China's technological power, at least partly, to this quid pro quo policy. So we also observe more and more technology disputes between US and China, between China and other developed countries in the past couple of years. So the big question here is, what contributes to the situation today? Should China solely be responsible for all the technology disputes? Or are there any Western-driven factors that may have contributed to China's technological rise? So in this paper, instead of banning China, we will shift the focus a little bit to foreign multinational firms and their corporate governance policy. So the goal here is try to understand whether there are any frictions within Western companies that may have affected their responses to China's foreign investment policy, and in turn, the long-run technological advantage of those foreign multinational firms. So friction modern firms face today is the misalignment of interest between managers and shareholders. And to address such misalignment, we know that CEO compensation has received a major shift in its structure, moving away from a more kind of cash-based payments to placing more and more weight on components that are sensitive to financial performance. So this is the so-called financialized corporate governance. Today, we see Western CEOs often receive high-powered and sometimes short-term financialized incentives. It is quite easy to see why CEO incentives or CEO compensation can matter in the presence of a quid pro quo. So access to the Chinese market usually can boost the short-term performance of the firm, while transferring technology to China as per the requirements of a quid pro quo may hurt the firm in the long run. So this is the long-term, short-term kind of trade-off we have in mind. And with this in mind, we will ask the following question. What is the role of CEO incentives in firms' decisions to form joint ventures with China and transfer technology to China? And more importantly, what are the long-term consequences to Western companies, especially in the technology space? To answer those questions, there are two major empirical challenges that we will face. So the first one is just the measurement issue. We know that technology transfer to China often has no paper trail, so it's very difficult to just get this data on paper on those contracts. And more importantly, it is also very hard for us to measure or evaluate the long-term consequences from those transfers. There are almost no widely accepted measures so far. Second, establishing causality is also not very easy. There could be, very common omitted variable issues that other firm-specific factors rather than CEO compensation could be driving the results. And also on top of that, China is such a unique market that its investment opportunities could be very different from that of the other countries. It's our strategy to try to address those two issues. So I'm not saying that we will be, solving those issues completely, but at least this is the first step trying to deal with them. So in terms of measurement, we are going to construct a panel at firm by transfer destination country by year level. And this panel is going to combine several international data sources. So first, we will use SDC Platinum to get information on global business relationships, such as joint ventures, strategic alliances, and technology, including technology-oriented partnerships. Then we will use PASDAC Global and USPTO data to construct the patent-based transfer and also the consequence measures. So for technology transfer from a firm to a foreign country, including China, we are mostly relying on duplicate patenting. So what is that? So that will reflect the amount of technologies being developed and first patented by a US firm in its home country, and then subsequently patented in different other countries. The main reason for us of using this measure is that all three major channels of technology transfer, including trade, FDI, and licensing, will all result in duplicate patenting in the end. So although duplicate patenting itself may not be a direct measure of technology transfer, its changes will closely track the changes in technology transfer and can therefore be considered as a proxy here. I will talk more about the definition and the validation of this measure a bit later. And for the long-term consequences in the next 5 to 10 years, we are going to construct 3 measures. One is technology sourcing, and then we are also going to look at a human capital migration, and more importantly, the future competition in the R&D space. Again, I will talk about the definition when I move on to the regressions that is, using those variables as outcome variables. Identification, we are essentially having a different strategy here. The first difference is that within the same firm year, we will compare China with other big countries, big developing countries. And then we have the second layer of difference, which is within the same country year and even within the same country industry year, we'll compare firms with the different CEO compensation schemes. So before I move on, let's have a preview of the key findings of the paper. So we first find that the higher portfolio delta, which is basically the dollar response to 1% increase in stock price, and that means high-powered incentives, can lead to more investment relationships and also technology transfer to China. The size of the effect is quite large. One standard deviation higher portfolio delta is associated with a 10% more transfer to China and 3 times a higher likelihood of doing investment in China. We also find that CEOs are becoming more responsive to high-powered incentives when there is lower institutional ownership, and basically those institutional ownership has longer-term perspectives on the firm, and also when there is a higher analyst coverage, which can drive the firm to care more about short-term profits. More importantly, we also find that CEOs also respond more in China's strategically emerging industries. So basically where the quid pro quo policy is likely to be more demanding and enforced strongly, and therefore has a stronger bite. And those findings seem to be consistent with CEO being myopic rather than more CEO effort being induced by a higher delta. And consistent with CEO being myopic, we also find negative consequences in the mid and the long run. And more specifically, we find that China relies more on the innovation of high delta firms, so firms with high-powered CEO incentives in producing its own future innovation. And on top of that, we find that those firms lose more R&D talents to China. And ultimately, those firms will face more competition from China in the technology space, especially in areas where those firms have their expertise. At the very end, we also provide global evidence. Basically, we compare US with other developed countries. We find that the technology transfer patterns actually line up quite well with the average CEO incentives being provided in each country. So this might help us better understand why US seems to be the biggest victim in technology disputes with China. Briefly on the literature, so this paper speaks mostly to 2 strands of work. One is about technology transfer and diffusion, especially the work on growth of China and its technology catch-up. So our paper deviates a bit from this line of work by adding firm-specific factors in technology exporting countries into the discussion, which can help us paint a more complete picture about how to understand China's technology catch-up. There are also, this also speaks to the interaction between US and China in terms of innovation. So I listed a few recent papers here on this topic. So our those papers mostly focus on how the rise of China affect US firms' innovation. And our research is kind of in the opposite direction, trying to document how US multinational corporations may foster future competition from China in technological innovation. And of course, this paper speaks to a long line of work on CEO incentives, on short-termism, and on its consequences. Our discussant, Moqi, actually has quite a few excellent and interesting papers on this topic. And our paper, our innovation here is to kind of move away a little bit from the typical US firm level setting, and then try to investigate the extensive technological and also investment relationships US firms establish with all the other countries. And we add to this literature by documenting an important real effect of CEO incentives, that is technology transfer to China, and also the implications for Western firms' long-term competitive advantage in R&D. And this will help us understand the microeconomic channel basically behind the rise of China's technology. All right, so I will continue to talk about more details of data measurement and also the empirical strategy. Let's first take a look at the data sources and how we construct the sample. So for US evidence, as I mentioned above, I'm going to construct this firm by transfer destination country by year panel. For firm, we merge a compute stat with executive comp. So we are basically left with US firms in S&P 1,500. Those are the large multinational firms who do business globally, including with China. Those are also the firms who do a lot of innovation. And for transfer destination country, we include 73 countries that have significant patent office in PASDAT Global. And those countries basically will also cover the majority of the economic and patenting activities globally. And our sample is starting from 1993 and runs until 2016. We also provide global evidence where the data is at the country, pair, and year level. So by origin country, destination country, and year. And the technology transfer origination country here include all countries with available CEO data in BORDEX. And here the sample is starting from a later year, from 1999. So this is the data on the CEO side. And then we have the data on, sorry, this is still kind of CEO incentives about the measurement of CEO incentives. So as I said, this varies typically at a firm year level. And the main measure is the delta measure. So this basically captures the change in equity portfolio value for 1% increase in the stock price. So the high delta means that there are stronger equity incentives for the CEOs. So quite a few papers argue that equity incentives tend to vest in the short run, and I listed a few of those series papers here. Since the typical vesting period for CEOs is just 3 years, while the negative effects of technology transfer may manifest over a much longer period, equity incentives can really tilt the trade-off between the short-term benefits of accessing the Chinese market versus the long-term costs of losing technology to China. So this measure is used by quite a few existing accounting and finance papers to try to document short-term behavior of the CEOs. And in the paper, we also consider other measures. Right now, we have added robustness checks using the scaled wealth performance sensitivity measure from Edmonds et al. 2009. And the strength of this measure is that it's independent of the size of the firm, so it automatically controls for size. And we also use the share of CEO compensation that is equity and option based. So this is out of total compensation. And in future work, we also plan to use the equity investing measure, which was developed by Edmonds et al. 2017, and also the contractual time horizon measure, which is actually developed by our discussant and her co-author. All right, then we need the measure on our outcome variable, which is technology transfer and all the long-term consequences in the technology space. So this will be varying at firm transfer destination country and year level, hence the ICT subscript here. So we measure this from patent priority. We measure technology transfer from patent priority. A priority right is typically triggered by the first filing of a patent application, and then it allows the claimant to file a subsequent patent application in another country for the same invention, effective as the filing date of the first application. What we are going to do here is to trace the sequence of patenting across all those different countries, from patent priority office to duplicate office country, and we call this duplicate patenting. So how do we do that? We start with all patents by firm I, and then we are going to find basically all the foreign patent applications with the same underlying technology using PASDAT. And then in the end, we will count the number and also the citation weighted number of patents in each country year with the priority traced back to US public firm I. And of course, why do we use this measure? So in 2004, Taylor identifies 3 key channels of technology transfer. One is trade, and then it is FDI and licensing. So trade is mostly for the technology embodied in the goods, and FDI include forming joint ventures, forming all the other investment relationships in the destination country. So the key argument here is that there is a partial trace of all 3 transfer channels in duplicate patenting at foreign offices. So first, we'll rely on patent protection in foreign countries, since any type of technology transfer would raise the risk of leakage and also imitation in the destination countries. And that's why the firms typically want to patent when the transfer takes place. In fact, previous literature also have documented a highly positive correlation between trade, FDI, and duplicate patenting. And another note is that duplicate patenting is often used conditional on the existence of a licensing agreement, especially for smaller offices. So although duplicate patenting itself cannot really be a direct measure of technology transfer, we think that its changes will reflect the changes in technology transfer and therefore can be considered as a measure for technology transfer here. And this approach of relying on patent priority rights to trace technology transfer has been used by quite a few existing papers. And I have listed those papers a bit here. So those papers are usually exclusively just talking about international technology transfer. Further validate the measure, we also examined the number of S&P 1,500 firms that invest or patent in China over time. So those figures here show that the number of S&P 1,500 firms, US firms with duplicate patenting in China actually tried quite closely with the number of firms investing in China. So blue line is for investment, the red line is for duplicate patenting. You can see that over time, those two variables really track well with each other when we look at all the relationships with China, and also when we look just at the technology-oriented relationships with China. So those patterns indicate that when firms establish business in China, they seem to do more duplicate patenting, likely as a reaction to the technology transfer in the presence of the quid pro quo policy. And briefly on the empirical specification. So as I mentioned before, the sample is a US firm, S&P 1,500 firms, and the observations is at a firm, destination, country, and year level, and that's why we have the subscript ICT here. And delta will capture the CEO incentives and it varies at firm year level, so the subscript IT, and then we have the China dummy CM. And this interaction term, delta interacted with China, is our key variable of interest. Its coefficient beta will reflect the differential responses in the outcome variable YICT to China and to other countries between firms with different CEO incentives. And in the regression, you can see that we have two sets of key fixed effects. One is gamma IT. So this is firm by year fixed effect, which will absorb firm-specific shocks such as time-varying investment opportunities at the firm level. And then we have the country by year fixed effects, alpha CT here. So this will absorb country-specific shocks, such as changing regulatory or macroeconomic environments. So in the main specification, we actually use a tighter one. We use alpha KCT here. So K here is industry. So this stands for country by industry by year fixed effect. So we add this in the regression to difference out any shocks affecting a specific industry in a specific country. All right, and a few other things here to ensure comparability. We also use this third equation here. So here we are basically comparing China with other big developing countries, so other BRIC countries. So this interaction term here is delta interacted with a dummy for other BRIC countries. And then we will be comparing the coefficient beta and the coefficient rho to see if China indeed has a special role here. And what are the things I want to mention here? Yes, standard errors is double clustered at firm and country level. And also we standardize this variable delta here actually to just facilitate interpretation, to have a mean of 0 and standard deviation of 1. Of course, all the results go through without this standardization. All right, I hope by this stage you have a rather clear idea about the setting and also the measures we are using. Now let's move on to the results. This table shows our baseline finding. And here, the outcome variable is technology transfer. So this is, as I said, measured from duplicate patenting. You can see that across all those 6 specifications with different fixed effects and with different controls, we always observe a positive effect on the interaction term between delta and China, suggesting that with higher delta, with more high-powered CEO incentives, there is also more technology transfer to China. And if we look at column 2 here, where we have the citation weighted measure, one standard deviation increase in delta actually is associated with 10% more technology transfer to China. So the difference between column 3 and 4 and column 1 and 2 is that in 3 and 4, we add this country by industry by year fixed effects. So when we are comparing within the same industry in the same country, we even have a slightly stronger effect. This coefficient becomes around 15%. And in column 5 and 6, we add the interaction between total pay and China in the regression. And you can see that the results are still quite similar to that in the previous specifications, meaning that only a small part of the result is driven by the difference in total pay. And this is the China and other BRIC country regression that I was talking about. So basically here, to have better comparability, we are going to contrast the effect in China versus the effect in other BRIC countries and with countries in Asia. And from this regression, you can see that again, there are insignificant results for other BRIC countries and Asian countries, and China indeed seems to be quite special here with this large and significant effect. On this page, we add the China dummy interacted with a lot of other lacked firm level characteristics, and you can see that the results barely change. If we compare those two coefficients with the baseline coefficients, the change is really just a minimum. And here we add country characteristics into the regression. So what we did here is to add delta interacted with other country level factors. So the purpose of doing this is to control for the difference in the size and growth of the destination market. So let's have a look at the estimated coefficients here. So you can see that these estimated coefficients are smaller compared with before. In fact, we find that the results are reduced by around 1/3 from 11% to around 7%, suggesting that 1/3 of the effect is actually driven just by the size or the potential of the market. And the remaining part, the 2/3, they are likely to be driven by China's special quid pro quo policy. And you can consider this 2/3 as the excess transfer. And this transfer basically cannot really be explained easily by the market or the economic fundamentals. So one worry is that duplicate patenting may reflect not technology transfer, but the commercialization of inventions in the destination country. And one way to test this is to compare the effect on process and product innovation. We know that product innovation will speak more to the commercialization process, while process innovation is more closely linked to the production technology and therefore the potential transfer of those production technologies. The worry is true that this duplicate patenting measure is all about commercialization in China. Then the effect of CEO incentives on patent priority should really be driven by product innovation. Therefore, we should observe a stronger effect for product innovation. And let's have a look at the results here. So here we have this interaction term between delta China and the share of process innovation. And you can see that the coefficient on this triple interaction term is actually positive, suggesting that instead of the results being driven by product innovation, it is mostly actually driven by process innovation, implying that duplicate patenting is more likely to be about technology transfer than about commercialization.
Bo, can we pause? It looks like there might be a couple questions.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Your co-author is suggesting Song's first question. Song, I'm volunteering you.
Of course, I think this question was also asked by some other people like Tang, like Mino, and so on. I guess what we're interested in is is like is something that people already started talking about. That is, there is a benefit of transferring technology by expanding the business or lowering production cost, which is what process innovation can actually help do. Therefore, there must be an optimal level of technology transfer that is happening here. I mean, by like basically, how do you think about this optimal level of potential technology transfer? This could be a non-clarification question, therefore feel free to postpone it. Yes.
Yeah, let me briefly just speak to that a bit. I will probably add more answers when we go to the Q&A section. So I think it's a very good question, also very important one. There could be inevitable technology transfer during the production process, especially if a firm is setting up a production site in China, for example, and those technology transfer could be, just limited and inevitable. And overall, the strategy of doing business in China could be optimal to the firm, right? And I think that's why it's important for us to think about the long-term consequences to the firm in the technology space. So whether the firm can really benefit in the long run, that can indicate a bit to us whether the firm is doing an optimal level of technology transfer.
I would just jump in here really quickly. That is, I think there's a little bit of a nuance still. That is, if in the short run, I made a lot of money, then even though in the long run that there was a negative consequence on net, it could still be a positive NPV there. I just want, I mean, I don't want to kind of delay too much of your, but that's a question. Hopefully we can decompose a little bit more.
So ideally, I think it's good to compare, what is the net NPV of doing business in China by factoring, the short-term profits and also the long-term costs. So we will think more about it, but ultimately it's not very easy to do, because if you want to calculate this one number, it takes really a ton of assumptions on, what is the horizon we are thinking about, what are the parameters we are going to use in terms of long-term, short-term profit versus loss. But yeah, we can definitely talk more about that. It's a very good question. All right, so yeah, we had a lot of robustness checks in the paper too. So we have dropped the EU countries because there could be potential management issues on duplicate patenting due to substitution between European Patent Office and national patent offices. We have also included some of the smaller firms because we care about mostly the large multinational firms doing business and doing technology transfer to China. And also we have used some alternative CEO incentive measures. This I actually have mentioned slightly above. The results all go through with those alternative settings. All right, so to understand the mechanism, we then studied the formation of cross-border partnerships. We find that with one standard deviation increase in equity incentives, US firms are actually 3 times more likely to form joint ventures and strategic alliances with China. So those organizational vehicles basically will facilitate the transfer of valuable technology from the US firms to their local Chinese partners. How should we interpret the above findings? We basically have found that with higher delta, with more high-powered CEO incentives, there is more technology transfer and there are more investment relationships being formed with China. But what does higher delta exactly capture? What do they really mean? There are 2 ways to think about it. On the one hand, high-powered incentives can induce effort from the CEOs. As developing China's market may require extra effort, and at the same time, there might be inevitable technology transfer in production. This could be overall optimal for the firm. So the relationship we observe could be just consistent with this limited but inevitable technology transfer. But on the other hand, the equity incentives, because they tend to vest in the short run, on average just 3 years, such high-powered incentives may also induce managerial myopia. So CEOs could be just more willing to exchange technology for short-term profits in China, which can then hurt the firm in the long run. So to differentiate between those 2 interpretations or 2 stories, we are going to explore cross-sectional heterogeneities that might speak to the cost of the cost and benefit trade-off of being short-sighted, we will look at both the firm level and industry level heterogeneities. And some of the tests here will also help us to further address some of the identification concerns. And at a later stage, we'll further study the long-term consequences, which hopefully will help us further disentangle the two interpretations, as the two stories will predict different long-term outcomes for the firm. All right. So in this table, we are going to first add a third layer of interaction, including institutional ownership and analyst coverage. So in column 1 and 2, we have this triple interaction term between Delta, China, and institutional ownership. We find that there is a negative and significant coefficient on this triple interaction term, suggesting that institutional investors are going to mitigate the effects of high-powered CEO incentives. And those institutional investors typically have longer perspectives, and this will suggest a conflict of interest between the long-term investors and the CEO. And this is, again, consistent with a myopia story rather than the effort-inducing story. So if we move on to columns 3 and 4, you can see that there is a positive coefficient on the triple interaction term with analyst coverage, suggesting that analyst coverage will strengthen the effects. And this also makes sense because the analysts usually impose short-term pressure on the firm's performance, and this will, make the CEO even more short-sighted and may transfer more technology to China as a result of that. We further study interactions with the financial constraints of the firm and with CEO ownership. We find quite consistent evidence here too. We find that financial constraints will amplify the effect of CEO myopia, while CEO being a major long-term shareholder of the firm helps. So on this page, we study industry level variation by focusing on China's strategically emerging industries. So those are the industries that the Chinese government really care about and want to push those industries to the technology frontier. So our prediction is that quid pro quo policy may have a stronger bite in those industries because the Chinese government just really care about those industries and may become more demanding in terms of technology transfer. And let's have a look at the result. We can see that there is this positive coefficient on this triple interaction term with SEI. So this is a dummy for China's strategically emerging industries. So this positive effect basically suggests that there is a stronger level, a greater level of technology transfer for industries that the Chinese government cares about. And the price for access to the Chinese market is therefore likely to be higher in those industries. And also taking a look at the size of the effect here, if we compare the size of the effect with the baseline, we can see that most of the effect is actually coming from those strategically emerging industries. All right, so far we see that firms with high equity incentives, with high delta, transfer more technology to China, do more business with China, and the heterogeneity results is consistent more with myopia, induced by high-powered incentives rather than effort being induced by those incentives. And the next important question we want to ask is, what are the really the long-term consequences for the US firms? Is it positive or negative? So one may argue that duplicate patenting means actually better intellectual property protection in China. So this is really not about excess technology transfer, and we should observe long-term positive results for firms with high delta because those firms better protect their technology in China. So this is one possibility. And also with the effort-inducing story we mentioned at the beginning, we should also observe a positive effect. On the other hand, if this is about CEO myopia and about excess technology transfer in the presence of quid pro quo, then we should really see a negative long-term outcome. So in the following part, we are going to study the long-term consequences in the technology space. The assumption here is that technology means a lot of future long-term profits. We consider the test here to be quite important because it will help us actually conveniently address some of the remaining measurements and also interpretation issues.
Bo, you have about 4 minutes.
Okay, yeah, I can finish this in about 45 minutes. So let me just briefly cover the three measures we use here. So we first have this technology sourcing by foreign countries. So this is based on the citation of US patents, from Chinese patents, and from patents developed by the other countries. And this basically will reflect firm ICE technology being used by country C, including China, in producing their own R&D. And then we count the number of US-based inventors moving from firm I to country C, and we call this international inventor migration. And then in the end, we also capture the exposure to future foreign competition in the technology space in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. And this will basically reflect exposure to competition from China by accounting for each firm's specialization in different technology classes. And you can consider this as firm-specific technology catch-up from each country. And let's quickly go through the results here. So first, in terms of technology sourcing, you can see from this regression that China sources more knowledge from firms with high delta, with more high-power CEO incentives, when China is producing its own innovation. This is true both in terms of application and granted a number of patents, and we also see a stronger effect over time. And in terms of international human capital movement, we have consistent evidence too. You can see that there is more R&D human capital moving away from the US public firms to China, and those are especially from firms with higher CEO equity incentives. And in the end, in terms of the exposure to competition in the technology space for each firm, the evidence is also very strong. You can see that firms with higher CEO equity incentives are more likely to face midterm to long-term competition from China in the technology space. So this coefficient on this delta interacted with China term is always positive and significant, while the coefficient on the delta interacted with other BRIC countries term is not significant and sometimes slightly negative. The size of the effect is quite large here. One standard deviation increase in delta actually is associated with 30 to 60% increase in the exposure to Chinese competition in patenting. Let me just quickly discuss some of the additional results that might be interesting, but we think it's not kind of the key finding of the paper. So first, about the dynamics, we divided our sample into 6 4-year periods and studied the effect in each period. We find that the dynamics actually look like an inverted U shape. So how should we reconcile this with reality? So this actually speaks to the development of the power interplay between US and China. So at the beginning, you can see that in the 90s, the effect is rather small. This is probably because China do not have much negotiation power at that time, and hence a lower effect. China's main focus at that time was to attract foreign investment, and then they gave really good terms to foreign companies. And then starting from the 2000s, we see a stronger effect. This is a period where Western firms become increasingly reliant on the Chinese market, and hence the Chinese market, the Chinese government has a higher negotiation power at that time. And more recently, when you move to 2013, 2016, we see that the effect goes down again. And we think this is because Chinese competitors are emerging globally, and Western firms are starting to take a tougher stand when it comes to transferring technology to China. Global evidence, as I mentioned above, if you plot the equity paid share on the x-axis and the technology transfer to China on the y-axis, you will see this positive relationship, and you will see US on the far right end, while some of the European countries will be on the left a bit. All right, I think I'm right on time. Let me just quickly conclude. So in this paper, we uncover the unintended consequences of CEO incentive contracts, and that is technology transfer to China and future competition from China in the technology space. And we find that because equity incentives tend to vest in the short run, we think the results are consistent with the incentive contracts inducing myopia regarding doing business in China. And at a broader level, this speaks to the cost of inducing high managerial effort ex ante. This also points to the importance of us thinking about the frictions within Western companies when we talk about technological conflicts with China. And also by pointing out the microeconomic channel behind China's technological advance, and also given the importance of technology and technology computation, this paper has implications on not only national, but also global welfare.
Perfect. Thank you for the very interesting paper and great presentation, Bo. And it's already attracted a lot of questions from Ting, from Wei, from Elaine, from Mimo, and there are a lot of interesting questions, and we look forward to hearing how you think about it. But before that, I'm turning the floor to Moqi, whose paper has been discussed by Bo quite a bit. So we look forward to hearing your discussion. So the floor is yours, Moqi.
Thank you very much for having me. Now, this quid pro quo policy at the center of this paper is very close to my heart. So quid pro quo, quid as technology transfer, and pro quo, the quo here being access to the Chinese market. So my very first job, or my very first internship, was with a joint venture between Daimler Chrysler and Yashing Coaches. I was an intern for Yashing Benz Limited, and they would make buses like the one depicted in the middle, which very much looked like a Mercedes bus at that time, which is the one on the left. And then a couple of years later, Yashing started to make their own buses more and more like the Mercedes buses. So that's the one you see on the right, that's a Yashing bus, competing with their own joint ventures products, and assembly lines started also assembling more and more the Mercedes assembly line, although their products were not quite perfect. So I remember one bus where the pipe for the tank went upwards, making it basically impossible to fuel the bus. Anyway, so I was, as an intern, I could not understand how Mercedes could allow such blatant technology transfer. But the posher interns at the headquarters in Beijing supposedly had a greater picture, and they told me that this is not about the buses at all. Who cares about the buses? It's all about the cars. And because they're willing to share their technology, they get access to the Chinese consumer market for cars, which is presumably very big, and sell all the Mercedeses. So that's supposedly the trade-off for quid pro quo. You get access to a very big market, the Chinese market, in exchange for knowledge transfer. Now, this is what the paper called short-term gains. So the market access, the added sales, and the knowledge transfer is what they call long-term losses. That assumes, and we've gotten into this discussion already earlier on, that the short-term gains are smaller than long-term losses, and this is all a bad decision, a negative NPV decision. And why would any firm make such a bad decision? Well, maybe because managerial incentives drive them to do so. So here, I think the story is the managers actually know that this is all a bad idea, but they still choose the suboptimal strategy because of their incentives. And why would they do that? Well, presumably they have incentives that make their wealth sensitive to the stock price. And now for the final ingredient to the story, so that must mean that the stock market must be overvaluing the market access and undervaluing the knowledge transfer for these incentives to point the managers into the wrong direction. Now, as many of you pointed out, it's not so clear that the trade-off goes that way. It could well be that the Mercedes cars are much more valuable than any bus technology for the Mercedes buses. But this is the story as it goes here. And these are the results that go with it. There are short-term results and the long-term. So the short-term ones are about technology transfer, and the long-term ones are about long-term competition. So the technology transfer here is measured as double patenting, patenting of technology that has already been patented back in the US in China. And that double patenting is more prevalent in firms with higher powered CEO incentives, so higher CEO equity data. And that goes with a set of long-term results, so the next 5 to 10 years. Firms where this is more prevalent, so the firms that do more double patenting, you see more inventors quit and move to China. Their patents get cited more often by Chinese firms. And third, the technology classes where they patent in, there are more Chinese firms patenting in the same classes, being interpreted as negative long-term effects of technology transfer. Now, is this negative or is this not negative? Well, that depends on whose point of view you take, I think. So if you take the point of view of the US government, it seems like they don't like it so much. Why is that? Well, maybe they don't benefit that much from the market access part, but they suffer from the competition and technology transfer part. That may be because US employment suffers from things being shifted to China, or it may be because they lose human capital to China in form of these inventors. Although, if I look at US immigration policy, I'm not sure how much they care about this. But I think my point is more that impact on overall welfare is not as clear as the US government's position because what we have shown here was really, more citations, more patents, etc. So this seems to be more innovation, more global innovation, which may be a good thing. There seems to be more competition, which also may be a good thing. The inventors seem to have more outside options, which is maybe good for them. And if they get more mobile, they become examples to the kids in China and set more global incentives to invest into human capital and become engineers themselves, etc. Now, of course, we may argue we don't care about the kids in China, we care about the firms and why they make presumably wrong decisions. So let's look at the firm. So let me first look at the technology transfer and then the long-term part. The technology transfer is measured as double patenting. So patenting of technology that is already patented, but this time in China. Now, I find it a bit contradictory or inconsistent to the quid pro quo policy, because isn't the quid pro quo explicitly demanding knowledge transfer? So I'm agreeing to knowledge transfer to China. So why does that knowledge transfer need patents? If my whole point is to transfer that knowledge and not to protect it from other people using it. So maybe I need protection because some third party, so not Yasing, my joint venture partner, but someone else may steal it and I still want to litigate against that third person. But if that's the case, then I would argue it's not so much about quid pro quo, but patent infringement, or law enforcement in general. So I don't know, I just felt I would like to understand more about this double patenting. Are these patents sharing with a partner or are these exclusive? Do we see litigation of the partner or third parties? Are these patents key technology that we're losing or French, like with our buses? Who is citing them? Is that our joint venture partner who is supposed to cite them, or are these other parties that cite them? So here I would just like to know a bit more about your measure and what it means. Now to the package of long-term effects. This is about citations and inventor mobility. So in the first instance, those measures really indicate to me that Chinese firms are using that technology, are using those patents. Now, whether that's good or bad for the US firm depends on what these patents are about. Are they substitutes or are they complements to the product? So it may well be that these are, a bag to the Apple phone, and then this is great if we get local bags, or this may be up and down the supply chain, which may also be really positive for the firm and not negative. But of course, if it's a substitute, it may be different. But then the question is, why should I then patent the technology in the first place if I'm just making a Me Too product? Now, here, I think it would be nice to see actual implications to the bottom line of the firms in terms of, let's say, market share, sales, etc., so that I can see how much competition do I have, and is that really competition? Is that hurting me, or is that actually helping? So that much about the patents. But now I'm really from the CEO incentives literature. And this is a literature with it's with some difficulties. Let me say, let me just give you a bucket list of the common complaints of referees in this literature. And this is not very specific to your paper, but we all suffer from the same problems and from the same referees. And so let's all suffer together. And I give you some examples of papers that overcame these problems, and then you can look them up yourself later. Okay, so the first problem in this literature is everything is connected. And of course, everything is always connected. Like if you think about bond covenants, they're all kind of connected and going to the same direction. It's really hard to disentangle the effect of one versus the other. But in CEO incentives, it's not only entangled, but it's sometimes just the same thing. And so here we have a main result that is CEO delta, and then we have a sample split that is CEO ownership, but ownership really is most of delta. So delta is the sensitivity of CEO pay, the sensitivity of CEO wealth, to the stock price. And of course, the more you own, the more you're sensitive to the stock price. So certain things are just very, very much interrelated. And then second, incentives are part of some contract, of some optimal contract, or presumably optimal, that the board closes with the executive. Now, presumably these contracts are forward-looking, taking into account how the business looks like in China and how much competition you may face and things like this, and then set to fit the situation you're in. So that means for empirically that everything you observe are going to be driven by both the expectations of the investment opportunities and something else that actually I don't know what that something is. So it's not exogenous, but it depends on the investment opportunities. So that's very hard to disentangle as well. Now, that's something else, maybe that someone is making mistakes. Now, and here the story was that someone is making mistakes, so presumably these firms are doing this quid pro quo, and this has terrible consequences. So why did they do that? Is it the manager who didn't know what they were doing? Where am I? Is it myopic investors that demand these firms to access China now? Otherwise, it will totally lose out to everybody else. Is it boards that are myopic? Is it is it voting advisors that face some other frictions and have make recommendations that are totally wrong for the firms that are facing? And maybe it's politicians that put pressure. So who is making the mistakes and why are they making the mistakes? Maybe it's just myopic investors, maybe facing information frictions because they don't know how valuable these technology capital is that's being transferred. I don't know, but someone seems to make a mistake, and so why is that? Now, the mistake here seems to be comparing the short, overvaluing the short versus undervaluing the long term. Now, this gives us specific empirical challenges because one is the short term, one is the long term. And the long term eventually becomes the short term, so this is all relevant because empirically you have to measure things over a certain horizon. So over what horizon would you measure the sales or the stock price, and how fast do they move versus how fast does the technology move? So here, I've done a lot of my own work on this that you can consider more or less successful. But given all of these points, what you then see published in this literature tends to be very narrow If you can't really identify anything, it's very local, it's very narrow. And that's exactly the opposite of this paper. So this is a bold question. This is international data, a lot of data, very granular with the patterns. And I would really encourage the authors to explore that richness of the data, to explore the heterogeneity here, both in geography and in, let's say, industries. So there is some exercise in market size. You can totally do that by industry to see how valuable market access is for one versus the other. Why do you stop at the US? You're talking about Western incentives versus Eastern incentives. Actually, I don't know what are Eastern incentives. Are they lower powered? Is it more family ownership and everything via the threat of turnover? I don't know. But Western for me is not only the US, now there's Europe, there's Canada, there's Australia, there's all kinds of countries that have a variation in these incentives that you can use. And why stop at China? So FootPro Policy is not only a Chinese thing, and finding nothing on the over BRIC level doesn't mean that, you know, some BRIC countries or other countries have this policy in some years, but not in others, etc., that you can use to help you. Now, quid pro quo is not only the policy, but that policy, as you said before, only works if certain conditions are met, like the market size needs to be big enough, there needs to be growth enough, there needs to be very bad law enforcement, really, because otherwise the patent infringements would just be persecuted. Now, these ingredients, and so it's about these ingredients as well as the policy. So here you can use the international heterogeneity in these ingredients as well as the policy to get more at, is it the policy, is it just China and some unobserved Chinese weirdness? And finally,
Which you have 1 more minute for you.
Yeah, okay. This literature in general tends to be very political, and that's maybe why I'm in this literature and I find it interesting, because the general public tends to care about it, politicians tend to care about it, but that's also dangerous because those audiences tend to simplify messages, play blame games, and have very little considerations of unintended consequences. So here, I hope you can be very careful about what you suggest and what your message is. So for example, when you list those policy recommendations at the end, I'll be very careful to embed those in a literature that talks about other consequences of these policy recommendations. But I have to stop. So this is a very relevant political question, and I really didn't want to discourage you or anything. I'm just telling you that in this literature, we face these challenges, all of us do. And I think it's great that young researchers like you take on these challenges and get into these questions. We need more of this. And I hope that this is of any help, and wish you best of luck.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Moqi, for sharing the experience from your internship as well as from the review process clearly. And anyway, so let's open up the floor a little bit. And what I would like to do is to first give the authors and the co-authors some opportunities just to pick a few things from either the discussion or from the chat channel, just to elaborate on some of the points in the responses, and then we can open for further discussions. So Bian and Jean-Marie, go ahead.
So I guess I will just start with responding to some of the comments from Moqi, and then Jean-Marie can probably jump in because he was more kind of monitoring the questions from the chat and see if there's anything that he wants to say about the chat.
In total, you have 5 minutes, by the way.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank Moqi for the excellent discussion. A lot of the points are just so relevant, and we will definitely take a look at those points that you are making in more detail. And first of all, I want to speak to the optimal level of transfer, which is the question from many of you. And I know that I have given some answers before, but I think there are a lot of things that we can do here to try to address this concern. So first, what we can do is to construct some buy and hold portfolio to just see, you know, what are the return in the long run when we are looking at the the firms that are transferring a lot of technology to China. And then we can look at, as Moqi has just said, we can look at the bottom result, more like bottom line of the firm. So what are the firm's sales in China in the next couple of years? Is it possible that the Chinese government is even tilting the playground towards more the Chinese local firms, and those, the US public firms are not only losing in the technology space, but also they are losing their sales gradually in China because the Chinese competitors has emerged already. And then in the end, we can also look at a different measure. So we're thinking about how about using like technology transfer scaled by sales in China. So that could be a better indicator of excess technology transfer. So it could be just scaling everything by, what is the market size for those firms in China? Are they transferring too much relative to their market size? So those are things that we think that we can potentially do in the future. And the comment on at the global level, whether this is a good thing or not, I think, this is a little bit beyond the scope of the paper. We do want to say, we're very open to this being a good thing in the future. But of course, this is a very political issue. And that's why I had a statement at the very beginning, and we need to really be careful in whatever we are saying here. And in terms of the measurement of CEO incentives, yes, I fully agree with you that after reading so many CEO papers, that I realized that it's very difficult to cleanly identify anything, especially if we have more, a broader setting. And we are currently thinking about probably to use what you have suggested, some granular text or legislation changes. For example, we can potentially use identification from the 2006 acceleration of option vesting. So we are thinking about whether there is more response from the firms that are being treated by those legislations. And I think I don't have many minutes, so I would rather just leave Jean-Marie a few minutes to address some of the questions from the chat. Thanks again, Moqi, for the excellent discussion. We will talk about this a bit later. Yeah.
Yeah, Hannah. So I think like Bo already came back to a question that came up a couple of times, which is the kind of like long-term, outcome for the firms on like the profits or profits per unit of Chinese sales or some buy and hold portfolio or so. This would then maybe provide additional evidence that it might not be optimal for the firm to transfer as much technology, at least at the margin relative to the benefits. I think something else that we are thinking about doing is to construct an alternative outcome variable that is using data on trademarks. So not on patents, but on trademarks, where we could construct a similar measure in which countries are you protecting your trademarks or designs. And there is like no argument that it's only like one way that you're benefiting from doing this, but there is no implication on any kind of technology transfer. And if you find no effect on this alternative outcome variable, but an effect for technology transfer, this would really speak to our argument on CEO incentives and the myopia interpretation. We're also thinking about looking at earnings calls of CEOs to see whether CEOs with different CEO incentives speak about the business in China in different ways, whether one CEO might emphasize more the short-term benefits of doing business in China, while another CEO might emphasize more the long-term competition or threat from China. That would also speak to our argument. And I think who mentioned on this, we're looking into some ways to get quasi-exogenous variation in CEO compensation. I think there is also under the Bill Clinton's administration a kind of like a policy change that provides variation in the structure of CEO pay. Then I think some other questions that came up.
Jean-Marie, how about we leave this after I conclude, and then I will leave the meeting open a little bit. Because we're running over time a little bit, and I know some people might have some other commitment. I want to respect everybody's time, and thank you very much for coming for the first seminar for the fall series of the WEFI. And thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you in future seminars. Thank you very much.